Welcome to another edition of Operation 3731 as we continue our memorization of Romans 8. This week we come to verses 36 and 37, which we will deal with together along with verse 35. Verse 36 says, "As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." And verse 37, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Now, as I said, verses 36 and 37 are vitally connected to verse 35. In fact, they conclude the thought begun in verse 35, where Paul said, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword?" Verse 36, if you look at verses 35 to 37 together, you can see that verse 36, with this introductory phrase, "as it is written," is Paul's Old Testament foundation for his claim made up in verse 35, that tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, and sword cannot separate us from the love of Christ. Paul does this all the time in his writings. He will make a statement and then he will give a scriptural foundation to it from the Old Testament with that introductory formula of "as it is written" or "for it is written." Now, how do we know then? What is verse 36 doing? How do we know that these things, tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, how do we know that they shall not separate us from the love of Christ? Well, we know it because it is written in Psalm 44:22, that's where this reference is from, that the saints, in the course of living a godly life, right? These saints are not suffering for sin, they're suffering for your sake. That is, for the Lord's sake. So that in the course of living a godly life, the saints will suffer at the hands of evil people in an evil world. And then verse 37 provides the conclusion of the matter, right? So far from separating us from the love of Christ, in all these things, these things again are the seven things mentioned in verse 35, tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, and sword. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. In fact, these things are the means by which we conquer through Christ. Now, as I've already exposited verses 36 and 37 in the previous video in verse 35, let me just sort of briefly recap those two main points that I made from these verses. First, the love of Christ by which we conquer is grounded in the death of Christ on the cross. In verse 37, this word "loved" through him who loved us is an aorist tense verb, which denotes a completed action, right? It's not always past tense. It's not exactly equated with past tense, but it does denote a completed action. And so that tells us what manner of love Paul is thinking of. In terms of Christ's affection for us, that is ongoing. That's not a completed action. So in order for this to make sense, it must be referencing some act of love that Christ has completed in the past. Now, what act of love might Paul have in mind? Well, we mentioned that Romans 5:6-8 would indicate that this love is the death of Christ upon the cross. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? So the love of Christ by which we conquer is the death of Christ on the cross for us, that supreme act of love. And then secondly, what has the love of Christ demonstrated in the death of the cross done for us? Well, it has made us more than conquerors, right? Literally, it has made us super conquerors. super victorious in all these things. In what things? Again, in all the things mentioned up in verse 35. In all these terrible things mentioned in verse 35, and you could even throw in verse 36, right? Being killed all the day long, being as sheep to be slaughtered. In all of those things, we are more than conquerors. And note this, I just want to highlight this preposition here. In all these things, not despite all these things, right? That's not what Paul is saying, but in all these things, we are more than conquerors. So what Paul is saying is that all those things that we think must surely be evidence that Jesus doesn't love us or doesn't care for us are in reality the very things through which Christ's love, accomplished for us on the cross, makes us super conquerors, super victorious. So it's not that tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, slaughter just happen, but that Christ's love helps us to overcome them. And it is that these things in themselves are the instrument of Christ's love by which he is determined to make us glorious. In all these things, we are more than conquerors. This more than conquerors, I would take to be a reference way on up here to verse 29, where we're being conformed into the image of Christ. In other words, glory, right? All of these things are the means by which Christ is bringing us to glory. So as we close, let's recite verses 35 to 37 together and inscribe it upon our minds. Verse 35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us.